I never expected to wake up to a knock at 4:28 a.m., especially not from him, my stepson. The house was eerily silent, yet my heart pounded louder than ever. When I opened the door, Ryan stood there, pale and trembling. His haunted eyes met mine. "I didn't know who else to come to," he whispered. And in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. When I married David, I thought I was stepping into the perfect life. He was kind, stable, and loved me deeply, or so I believed. At 38, I finally felt like I had found my place, a home where I belonged. But what I didn't anticipate was his son, Ryan, becoming such a complicated part of our lives. Ryan was 20, quiet and guarded. He had just gone through a tough breakup, and David thought bringing him to live with us would help him heal. At first, I tried to make him feel welcome, leaving breakfast out for him, asking about his day, but his responses were short, polite, and distant. He barely looked at me, and I couldn't blame him. I was his father's new wife, an outsider in his world. I wanted to bridge the gap between us, but it felt impossible. We were like strangers forced to share the same space, tiptoeing around each other. I would often catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't angry or resentful, just searching, as if he was trying to figure me out. David, on the other hand, was always busy. Late nights at the office, weekend trips for work. It left me and Ryan alone in the house more often than not. The silence between us became heavier with time, and I couldn't tell if it was loneliness or something more unsettling creeping into our dynamic. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining the tension, but the way Ryan's eyes lingered and the hesitation in his voice told a different story. He wasn't just dealing with heartbreak. He was lost, drifting, and desperate to hold on to something or someone. And maybe, just maybe, I saw a reflection of myself in him. I had my own fears, my own insecurities, and the more time we spent in that house together, the harder it became to ignore them. So when he knocked on my door that night, pale and trembling, part of me knew this wasn't just about a late-night talk. It was something far deeper, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The days after that night felt different, charged, almost. Ryan didn't mention our late-night conversation, but the way he looked at me lingered in my mind. It wasn't just gratitude or relief. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. He was vulnerable, and I was just being supportive. That's all it was. But the way he lingered in the kitchen while I made coffee, or the way his gaze followed me when he thought I wasn't looking, those weren't things I could ignore. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, I felt it again, that prickle of being watched. I turned to find Ryan standing in the doorway, his arms crossed. "Need something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just thanks for the other night. I really needed someone to talk to." I smiled, hoping to put him at ease, but his eyes lingered on me too long. "Of course. Anytime." His lips twitched into a half-smile before he turned and walked away, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. David remained oblivious. He was still buried in work, often coming home late and heading straight to his office. I didn't tell him about Ryan's visit. I told myself it wasn't worth mentioning. It was harmless. But a voice in the back of my mind nagged at me, whispering that I was hiding it for a reason. The tension built slowly, like the air before a storm. Ryan started finding excuses to be near me, asking for help with small tasks, lingering in doorways when I was alone. I told myself it was harmless, but each interaction left me uneasy. One night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when Ryan appeared behind me. I jumped, startled by how quietly he had entered. "Sorry," he said quickly. "Didn't mean to scare you." I laughed nervously. "It's fine. Just lost in thought." He stepped closer, leaning against the counter. "You've been really nice to me, you know. Most people wouldn't be." I wiped my hands and turned to face him. "Ryan, you're family now. That's what families do." His eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't look away. "Not all families," he murmured. I froze. There was something in the way he said it, something raw, aching. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, but something in my gut told me to keep my distance. Before I could respond, he reached out and touched my arm. Just briefly, but the contact sent a jolt through me. I pulled away instinctively, and he stepped back, his face flushing. "Sorry," he muttered. "I didn't mean." "It's okay," I cut him off quickly, but my heart was pounding. The rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that a line had been crossed. One I couldn't quite name, but felt deeply in my bones. I started locking my bedroom door at night, telling myself it was just for peace of mind. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I knew it wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was something far more dangerous, the flicker of a connection I wasn't sure I wanted to admit existed. The next few days passed in a haze of tension. Ryan's presence seemed to fill every corner of the house. I couldn't walk into a room without noticing him, his lingering glances, the way his body seemed to angle toward me whenever we were near each other. I kept telling myself it was nothing. He was just lonely, confused, and looking for comfort. But deep down, I felt it too, an undercurrent of something dangerous, something I wasn't ready to name. One evening, while David was out of town for work, Ryan and I found ourselves alone again. The house felt too quiet, the walls too close. I had poured myself a glass of wine and was curled up on the couch with a book when Ryan appeared in the doorway. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I hesitated for just a second before nodding. Of course. He sank into the couch beside me, closer than I expected. My heart fluttered, and I hated myself for it. I tried to focus on my book, but I could feel his eyes on me. "What are you reading?" he asked, leaning in slightly. I turned the cover toward him. "Just a mystery novel." He nodded but didn't move away. Instead, his arm brushed against mine. I told myself it was an accident, but neither of us pulled back. "You always seem so put together," he said suddenly, his voice low. I laughed nervously. "Trust me, I'm not." "No," he insisted. "You are. You make me feel safe." I swallowed, my pulse quickening. "Ryan, Before I could finish, his hand grazed mine. It was brief but intentional. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, pulling away. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I interrupted, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt myself sinking under the weight of his gaze. "You don't have to keep pretending," he said softly. "Pretending what?" I asked, but my voice wavered. "That you don't feel it too." My breath hitched. "Ryan, this isn't." He leaned in closer, his eyes searching mine. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting to be near you." I stood abruptly, putting distance between us. "This has to stop," I said, my voice shaking. He looked up at me, his expression raw. "I'm sorry. No, Ryan," I cut him off. "You're hurting and I get that. But this, whatever this is, it can't happen." Tears welled in his eyes, and for a moment, I thought he might break down right there. But instead, he stood and walked toward me. "I don't want to lose you too," he said quietly. "You're not losing me," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "But we need boundaries. This isn't healthy, for either of us." He nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "I just don't know how to stop feeling this way." I wanted to comfort him, to reach out and reassure him. But I knew that any touch, any kindness, would only blur the lines further. "I think you need to talk to someone who can help you work through this," I said carefully. His jaw tightened, and he took a step back. "Right. Got it. Ryan." But he was already walking away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my hands trembling. I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. How had it come to this? When did simple kindness turn into something so complicated? I hated the way my body had reacted to him, the way my pulse quickened and my skin tingled at his touch. It made me feel dirty, guilty, and yet alive. I couldn't let it happen again. I wouldn't. But as I sat there, staring at the empty doorway, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't over. Not yet. I barely slept that night. The echoes of Ryan's words, "You don't have to keep pretending," played over and over in my head. I told myself it was over, that I had set boundaries. But the weight of his confession lingered, suffocating me. The next morning, I avoided him. I made excuses to stay in my room, pretending to be busy when really, I was trying to keep myself together. But avoidance only lasted so long. Later that evening, I heard a knock at my bedroom door. My stomach dropped. "Ryan," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's me," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" I hesitated before opening the door. He stood there, looking just as fragile and desperate as he had the night before. I wanted to close the door to shut him out, but something in his eyes stopped me. "Ryan, we shouldn't." "I just need to talk," he interrupted. "Please." I stepped aside, letting him in, but I kept my distance. He sat on the edge of my bed, his shoulders slumped, and ran his hands through his hair. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath caught. "Ryan." "No." He cut me off, standing abruptly. "You don't get it. You're the only person who's ever made me feel like I matter." And I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I took a step back as he closed the distance between us. My heart raced, panic clawing at my chest. Ryan, this isn't okay, I said firmly, but he didn't stop. He reached for my hand, and I froze. Don't push me away, he whispered. I need you. I pulled my hand back quickly, but he didn't retreat. Instead, his eyes burned into mine, full of raw desperation. Ryan, you're confused, I said, trying to steady my voice. You're lonely, and you're looking for something to hold on to. But this isn't it. He stepped closer. Then why does it feel like it is? I felt my back hit the wall. Because you're hurting, I snapped. And I'm the closest thing you have right now. But this isn't love, Ryan. It's pain. And we can't. Suddenly, the door burst open. Clara. I turned to see David standing in the doorway, his face twisted in confusion. And then anger. What the hell is going on here? Ryan stepped back, guilt written all over his face. Dad, it's not. Get out, David barked. Ryan hesitated, but David's glare sent him out of the room without another word. The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with my husband. David, it's not what it looks like, I started, but the words felt empty even to me. What it looks like, he said coldly, is my wife standing in a bedroom with my son, looking like you've both been caught doing something you shouldn't. Tears welled in my eyes. He's confused, David. He's hurting, and I was trying to help him. Help him, David shouted. By letting him into your room? Bye. No. I cut him off. It's not like that. I set boundaries. I told him it couldn't happen, but he wanted it to happen. David's voice cracked, and the realization in his eyes shattered me. I didn't know what to say, how to make him believe me. I never. Don't, he said, his voice low and sharp. Don't stand there and lie to me. The silence between us felt deafening. Finally, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there alone, my world crumbling around me. I sank to the bed, tears streaming down my face. Everything was broken, my marriage, my family, and any trust we had left. But the worst part? A small, ugly part of me wasn't just crying over the fallout. It was crying over the loss of Ryan too. The house felt colder after that night, like the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and refused to let it go. David didn't come home that night. He left without a word, slamming the door behind him. I sat on the edge of the bed, my thoughts spinning out of control. I wanted to explain, to make him see that nothing had happened. But how could I? The look in his eyes when he saw us said it all. Trust was gone, and no amount of words could undo what he thought he'd seen. The next morning, I found Ryan in the living room, slumped on the couch, his face buried in his hands. He didn't look up when I entered. Ryan, I started, but he cut me off. I ruined everything, didn't I? His voice cracked. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that we were both to blame. But instead, I sank into the chair across from him, my voice barely a whisper. David thinks something happened, I said. Ryan finally looked up, his eyes red and puffy. And what if it did? What if, he trailed off, his voice trembling. No, I snapped, sharper than I intended. Nothing happened, Ryan. And nothing can happen. His face fell, and for the first time I saw it clearly, how much this had broken him. I never meant to make things worse, he said. You just what? I interrupted. Needed someone? I get it. But this? It crossed a line, and now we both have to deal with the fallout. He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up and walked toward the door. Where are you going? I need some air, he muttered. I let him leave, my chest tightening as the door clicked shut behind him. For the rest of the day, I waited for David to come back, for Ryan to return, for something to give me clarity. But all I had was silence. When David finally came home that night, his expression was hard, unreadable. We need to talk, he said. I nodded, bracing myself. He sat across from me, his arms crossed. Do you love him? His words hit me like a slap. What? No, of course not. Then why was he in your room? Why did he look at you like that? I swallowed hard. Because he's lost, David. He's broken, and I was trying to help him. But I messed up. I should have set clearer boundaries. Boundaries? David's voice rose. Boundaries don't explain the way he looked at you, or the way you looked back at him. Tears welled in my eyes. I didn't. But you did, he interrupted. Maybe you didn't mean to, but you let it happen. And now I don't know how to fix it. I wanted to reach for him, to tell him we could get through this. But the distance in his eyes told me otherwise. I think you should go, he said finally. I froze. What? I need time, he said, his voice softer now. To figure out if I can trust you again. My heart shattered. David, please. No, he said firmly. Just go. I packed a bag that night, tears streaming down my face. Ryan wasn't home when I left. I didn't know where he had gone, and I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. As I drove away from the house, I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. The guilt, the shame, the regret. But what scared me the most? The tiny flicker of relief that came with leaving it all behind. The first night away from the house was the hardest. I stayed at a small motel on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment over and over again. How had things unraveled so quickly? How had I let it get this far? David didn't call. Neither did Ryan. And the silence felt deafening. For days, I debated reaching out, but fear kept holding me back. Fear of what David would say. Fear of what Ryan might still feel. I hated myself for the mess I had made, but more than that, I hated how a small, shameful part of me missed Ryan's presence. It wasn't love, I knew that now. It was something darker. Loneliness. A craving for connection in a house that had felt so empty for so long. And Ryan, he had latched onto that same emptiness, mistaking it for something more. But none of that excused what happened. None of it made the damage any less real. Eventually, I called David. "I want to come home," I said, my voice trembling. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "Things can't go back to the way they were." "I know," I whispered. "We need to fix this," he said, his voice firm. "But it's going to take time. And Ryan, he needs space. Maybe even therapy." I swallowed hard. "I'll give him that. I'll give you both that. I just want to try." When I finally returned home, Ryan was gone. David told me he had moved in with his mother temporarily, which felt like the right decision for all of us. The house felt emptier than ever, but this time I welcomed the quiet. It gave me time to think, to reflect. I learned that vulnerability can be dangerous if it isn't handled carefully. Loneliness doesn't justify crossing boundaries, and no matter how strong the urge to fill the void, it's never worth losing the trust of the people you love. I worked on myself after that, on the parts of me that had felt so lost, so desperate for attention that I missed the warning signs until it was too late. David and I started counseling. It wasn't easy, but it helped us rebuild, slowly, brick by brick. Trust takes time, and I was prepared to earn it back no matter how long it took. As for Ryan, we kept our distance. I wanted him to heal, and I knew that meant letting him go. The last time we spoke, he thanked me for pushing him away. He said he was getting help, figuring out who he was and what he wanted. And I believed him. Now, whenever I think back to that night, I don't just feel guilt. I feel gratitude that we stopped before crossing a line we could never come back from. Because no matter how tempting it might be to blur boundaries, some lines are meant to be drawn. What would you have done in her situation? Was she right to push Ryan away? Or should she have handled it differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. And if you're ready for more shocking stories of secrets, betrayal, and forbidden desires, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Trust me, you won't believe what's in store.